Hello, welcome to another episode of the Data Science Leaders Podcast. In today's episode, I have Jan Neumann, and Jan is the Executive Director of Machine Learning at Comcast. He holds a PhD in computer science from the University of Maryland. Jan is responsible for AI-powered products and has 8 different areas of focus with Comcast, and we'll touch on that briefly today. Welcome to the DSL Podcast, Jan.
Thanks, Dave. Glad to be here.
Great. Well, let's go ahead. There's a few agenda topics that we have for today's podcast. One is managing large data science teams and sort of at scale. I think another thing that's sort of interesting about your management style is you like to stay active in projects. We're going to talk a little bit about that. And then last but not least, we're going to be talking about a feature store and how that has sort of impacted your team. I think we'll also talk, especially for my edification, just a little bit of background on how a feature store works. And love to just hear from you about how it's impacted your data science team. Does that sound good?
Sounds great. Looking forward to it.
All right, let's start off right at the top. So 8 different areas of focus. Talk to us a little bit about what those areas of focus are, and then we'll get going there.
Sure. So I like to break down the areas of focus into kind of 5 customer-facing areas and 3 back-end areas. So customer-facing, like one of the biggest teams, is the team responsible for the Comcast voice remote and our chatbots. So anything related to natural language processing, speech recognition, and related technologies. So we kind of encapsulated all of that. Another team is focused on content recommendations as well as content search. So if anybody uses the Xfinity kind of entertainment systems, if you want to find something to watch, that's the systems you interact with. Third, like for these systems to work, they need to understand kind of what's happening in TV shows. And often the descriptions we get from providers are very high level. So we have a team that we call media analytics that kind of really goes into the movies, into the TV shows, and analyze them using computer vision, natural language processing, looking at closed captions, and extracts interesting information about like who's on screen when, kind of when do ads start, like what are the different segments, and then surfaces that so that content recommendations and voice can actually access that information and surface like interesting programs for you.
Right.
In the non-entertainment area, I'm also responsible for the teams that look at machine learning in the home. So we have a security offerings where we sell security cameras. And so my team is developing the algorithms that both run on the cameras and in the cloud to analyze what's happening. Like who, for example, like is it a person? Is it a car? Is it a pet? Mm-hmm. People love watching the pets on the cameras. So that's a very popular thing to recognize. Also connectivity, like how can we use machine learning to improve the connectivity experience for our customers? Mm-hmm. And in general, like machine learning on the edge falls into like that portfolio. And then finally, we also are looking at how machine learning and AI can help us improve our customer service experience. So if unfortunately something don't work as expected, how can we kind of address the issues of our customer as effectively as possible to get them back to doing what they love? And so that kind of involves kind of the chatbot where in kind of close cooperation with the voice team and natural language teams, we kind of analyze what the customers are trying to do, but also then augmented with analyzing all the telemetry from our network and our various devices and services to quickly identify what the best troubleshooting solutions are, for example. So those 5 customer-facing areas are then supported by 3 kind of more back-end teams. One focused on building our experimentation platforms, A/B testing, right? So that we can quickly test out ideas and use data to make informed decisions. Another one focuses on doing all the data engineering, the pipelines and analytics to kind of plumb these different pieces together. And then finally, we also have a team that is focused on building AI and ML platforms to make these other machine learning teams more effective and kind of take over the heavy lifting with frameworks.
Wow. So, I mean, it certainly sounds like you have both the enablement type teams, the teams that are focused on sort of supporting the more vertical or product specific teams, like your content recommendation team, the team that's focused on speech, your sort of media analytics team, and so on. So you have both of the supporting teams as well as the more specific teams. Is that correct?
That is correct, and this is actually a good feature because by kind of being under one roof, I can really kind of connect the people who have the problems with the people who can solve them. And also, each of these teams individually is kind of like a laboratory where they might try out already some certain like approaches to problems, and which then kind of, if they work really well, we can see if they can be generalized to also help the others, and then they kind of transfer over into that platform team from the individual team and help everybody.
Makes a lot of sense. And out of curiosity, how large is your if you look across all your eight different teams, like how many employees do you have underneath that?
It's about 250 to 300.
That's a very, very large team. So the first sort of a topic here is how do you manage like all eight of those teams? Like, and it sounds like you've already sort of answered my own question, which is you have it's not like you just like you have the five teams and the five teams only. Like you've actually built out, which is really interesting, that enablement layer as well. But how do you personally manage it all? That's what has me most curious.
I mean, the most important part is that you have kind of a good team to kind of manage that. And so the way we are organized is that each of those 8 areas has a dedicated lead who kind of owns basically that team pretty much end to end. And then it's really my job to kind of work with them to facilitate their work, help them develop the strategy, make sure that the strategy aligns across the different verticals and teams. And then sometimes if they are kind of in overlapping areas, or if there are some of the teams and their goals or some of the decisions are potentially in conflict, then I will need to make decisions that I kind of see are in the best interest of the larger org. And that's kind of like how I can scale, like, because I can definitely not be in the weeds for all of these different teams.
Sure. Are these teams, these leaders, is there like a corresponding sort of leader, for lack of a better term, just on the business side? So like for these various product areas, is it sort of mapped to one-to-one, or is it a one-to-many type relationship there?
It is somewhat of a one-to-many, depending on the complexity of, like, be, for example, partners on the product side or on the business side, where I work, for example, with one partner who is responsible for both content discovery and media analytics. But then I have one partner who is responsible for voice, and then another area which I'm not responsible for. So overall, we're kind of matrixed.
Got it.
And then usually it's kind of the level underneath us where it's a kind of a one-to-one relationship between kind of one leader per function who's responsible.
And then how do you measure, like, if I'm a team lead for you, right, and I'm partnering with you, like, what are some of the things that you would measure me by?
So I would mainly, what I look at is kind of outcomes, so customer outcomes. So we establish kind of the goals, like, for example, for Comcast overall, I mean, we're mainly a subscription business. So customer satisfaction is our key metric. Like, is the customer happy with the services that we provide so that they continue kind of subscribing to our services? And so we then kind of, for each of the different areas, try to establish specific kind of metrics, like leading indicators for that. And so I'm reviewing those metrics with my team to see how we're doing on those outcomes. And so that's kind of like one dimension of it, like of the overall kind of team performance outcome, which is outcome focused. I'm also looking at how's the team itself doing, like team happiness. Are they kind of delivering on time? Are people staying within the team? Like, what's the overall kind of sentiment? And that's also where I do skip levels a lot, which I find extremely valuable to kind of hear unfiltered from the people on the team how everything is going, and kind of build up my picture based on that. Because often, right, if you have a team that is not happy, they can't generate good outcomes. And so that's another signal that I look at. And then there's also the feedback from the business, from my peers about kind of what they see and how the teams are working. Are they kind of meeting their promises, keeping to their commitments, etc.? And if they're not, that then also something that I can then kind of first discuss with the leader to see kind of what's going on. And then potentially, if there's opportunity where it is necessary for me to get additional context, I might dive in a little deeper to understand the problem and then see how I can best facilitate for the team to get back on the right track.
Got it. So, I mean, what I sort of wrote down here, and to summarize, you look at the various leading indicators of the business, right? And obviously the ones that sort of pertain to their part of the business, and you measure against those sort of goals. You also collect feedback from peers. You also have sort of skip level conversations as well, and obviously you have your own personal interactions too with the team. Did I miss anything there?
No, I mean, no, that captures it pretty well. I mean, the way I usually like to describe my leadership philosophy is empowering with guardrails.
Yeah.
And specifically, the guardrails are not saying, hey, you can't do this or you can't do that, but it's asking questions, asking the tough questions. Like, why do you think this is a good idea? Right? And if you maybe actually have very good reasons for why you want to do that, even if it sounds risky to me without the necessary context, but then via the discussion, we usually kind of dive in, then either it's a coaching moment where I can provide, for example, maybe I see something that I've seen somewhere else before and I can bring it in, or they teach me something and I see, oh yeah, I didn't think about it, and within this context, this makes perfect sense. Let's try to do that. But overall, it's a matter of like trusting that the people on the team are good, because then if I trust them, they also trust their leaders correspondingly, and it kind of goes deeper into the organization and kind of creates that culture of like ownership where people take care of the issues when they see them, right? Rather than just executing what is being told from above. So that never really works.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you have to empower your team and make them feel ownership, right, in order for them to really succeed. And that's where I think a lot of the creativity comes from as well. If they feel empowered, then they also will come up with their own ideas and then share them with you, which kind of leads to the next topic, which is, not every data science, most data science leaders have a certain degree of involvement with the projects themselves. Like some, see their role to sort of manage the projects at a high level. Others like to stay active in projects. You seem to fall into that second bucket, which I think is great, right? So what do you do to stay sort of current as a data scientist and not just as a leader with regards to getting involved in project work?
I mean, I think the core part is like curiosity and always wanting to learn and evolve, right? And I mean, I just am fascinated by machine learning, data science, and how we can solve problems, and trying to also phrase it into kind of larger frameworks, which I really like, of how can I generalize that, and also like generalize kind of like the details. Like, so I might not be an expert in building deep learning models, but I want to know like what are the general concepts of why do we kind of move and use transformers for a lot of problems right now, and want to be able to, at least at the high level, kind of ask the team of how, and have a kind of a in-depth discussion with the team about why these technologies could potentially give us a boost in some of our applications or not. And so for that, like reading a lot of blog articles, YouTube, following conference papers, and at least kind of reading the abstracts to kind of see what is happening in the field, so that even if I can't really be familiar with all the details anymore, at least I know the jargon, I know the high level ideas, why people are looking into this, or what the kind of problems are that people consider important, and can then use that again to guide the team if necessary.
Well, this might seem like an in the weeds question, Jan, but I just know from my personal experience, it is so difficult to carve out time during the week, right, to actually do the personal sort of growth and watch the YouTube articles, read the blog posts. Like, how do you carve out the time? I mean, with a team that large, I have to imagine that things are getting yes, you have your leaders, but things that get escalated, and you have multiple strategic conversations with the business side, et cetera. Like how are you able to carve out the time?
I mean, it is challenging to do it during work hours. I mean, like before kind of COVID, I would use a lot of my commuting time
Yep.
to kind of listen to the podcasts, and kind of I take a bus for part of my commute, so I could even watch YouTube videos, or read papers. But obviously, that is not an option. And with like constant meetings, kind of the day has expanded. So fortunately, I mean, or unfortunately, a lot of this has now been pushed more into the weekend.
Right. Right.
But because I really enjoy it, and it's actually, I don't feel it's a chore, right? It's actually something that I find really fascinating. It's actually, like I usually spend some time kind of on the weekend just kind of browsing and reading and seeing what's new.
Yeah. I was.
Otherwise, also exercising is a great opportunity to kind of watch YouTube videos and kind of combine two good things together.
Yeah. Yeah. I was going to say that you might be one of the few who's looking forward to their commute when COVID eventually hopefully lifts. So that's I'll put you in that bucket. So I think so. Speaking of sort of listening to podcasts and YouTube and so on. Is there any ones outside, of course, of the DSL podcast that you would recommend?
That's the number one.
Of course. Yeah. Is there ones that you sort of go back to that might be interesting?
So interesting enough, I mean, my favorite ones right now are actually not even machine learning related, but I love the kind of DevOps, enterprise focused ones by Gene Kim. Like his podcasts are fantastic. I mean, they are 2 hour discussions with kind of leaders about organizational designs and how to make teams work better together, which is, to be honest, a lot of actually the kind of problems that I'm solving at my level.
Right.
It's not the technical problems. We have really good people on the team. That's what they are good at. It's like how to make all these really smart people work effectively together. And I found like his podcast is really good. There's another one by Mick Kirsten, kind of Mick plus one, which I really enjoy. That is very good. And another one where I learn a lot from kind of like more in general about business is the Andreessen Horowitz, kind of both kind of when kind of they like their Clubhouse recordings, and there's the bus talk with Ali Ghodsi from Databricks, which also gives you a lot of kind of like leadership insights. And then the other one, which I can highly recommend, is Coaching for Leaders.
It's interesting that I was expecting, given what you were talking about with regards to staying current and doing some research on deep learning, that a lot of your podcasts actually tend to be more on the sort of leadership side of things and sort of managing at scale, which I don't think is uncommon.
I mean, the one machine learning one I enjoy very much is Yannick Kilcher, like where he summarizes like the state of the art machine learning papers on YouTube. That's like a great kind of, also from a time boxing, it's perfect for an exercise session.
Well, after you listen to the DSL podcast, I'm sure that you can, I'll allow you to listen to those other ones. So speaking of which, I imagine that you at some point maybe read a blog post or maybe had a conversation with some of your enablement teams. And I wanted to talk a little bit about our third topic, which is, diving into the feature store. So, I've done, some reading. I personally have not used the feature store, but I'm curious, like maybe you can just start by explaining like what is a feature store and why should a data scientist care?
So a feature store is an abstraction that kind of encapsulate the kind of the development, registration, and serving of features. And some people also include the same, like the model development, model registration, and model serving as part of like the feature store ecosystem. But mainly what people realized is that when we look at the traditional workflow, like you might have a data scientist who's developing a model, they're doing feature transformations, they might do it on the laptop, right? And so now you want to run it in production for your thousands, millions of customers. If you kind of just take your feature transformations as is, often to begin with, they are often batch transformations because that's how you train kind of your models in the first place. But now in real life, like usually the kind of context, the features are available kind of one by one, or the requests come in one by one. So kind of how do you make that switch between batch to real time, but do it without kind of having to rewrite all your code, which kind of it's like, for one, it's time consuming. And then it's also very error prone because you're changing something that you've done before. And as we know, when we develop these kind of models, like the whole pipeline is very complex, right? Building features kind of under the hood, a lot of things are happening, and there might be subtle differences. And so a feature store is an abstraction that kind of allows you now access to data and kind of the transformations you apply to the data in a way that it abstracts the difference between offline and real time, or training and serving, so that you basically just say to your, like during training time, get these features, and it will return the features to you. And then during serving time, you will tell, for this given customer, etc., give me the features that matter, and then you get them. And behind the scenes, they make sure that the transformations are exactly the same, that the data is exactly the same, so that whatever you train, use the data that you use to train your models will be identical, like during serving time. And so that whole complex of technology making that possible is often called the feature store.
And I imagine you're doing your training on the offline data, and then you're doing the serving on the online data, or the real time.
Correct.
Online
Yeah.
data. Okay.
Exactly.
Got it. And in my head, and maybe this is, I don't know, maybe this is not like the right visualization, but in my head, I just have this vision of like, if you're, if you're training, if you're trying to score customers or something like that, that you just have like, millions of rows of all of your customers, and then the features are just sort of the columns. And as you add on additional features, those get added on as columns, and then they can be used in a very simple way to train your models. Is that kind of the right way to visualize it?
Right. Yes. I mean, that's a good way.
Sort of. Yeah. Like
sort of. Yeah.
Cool. So what made you? I mean, it sounds like there's some enormous benefits, right? One of the big benefits is, going from doing sort of feature engineering in batch, and then being able to just sort of flip a switch, so to speak, and have it being done in real time. That sounds like a huge win, because in the before having technology like this, like I would imagine, at least in my experience, to your point, you're sort of rewriting things and maybe even doing things in a completely different way, to have to sort of stream in sort of a streaming approach versus sort of a batch approach, are very different technologies. But so there's something magical about the feature store that allows you to quickly flip that switch, which sounds incredibly compelling. So what made you sort of, and then maybe you can talk a little bit how you actually implemented that, and what your experience was in implementing that at Comcast.
Sure. So, like what we came across, and this was initially in the customer service domain, that the team that we had stood up for developing the models, the data science team, they were using the Python stack as it's customary nowadays, like with the tools there. And so they were building their models in Python, doing feature transformations in Python. Mm-hmm. But then the system that we were using for scoring and processing the models had been developed in Java. And so there was that disconnect where we had to rewrite the models to make them work now within our serving infrastructure. And this could mean two things. Either we restricted the model complexity on the data science side, so maybe only use linear models because those are really easy to implement. You just dump the weights, you read them back in and execute them. Or that it would often, for the more complex transformation, take like 2-3 months to take a model from the development after it had been proven to work well on the kind of data, to actually transfer it into production. And so at that point, and that led to obvious frustrations from all different sides. Right? Like the team was not happy because it took them a long time until they got real-time feedback, or that before the impact for the business actually became real. And so at that time, we kind of realized, kind of looking at what is the problem here, that we needed to basically remove that distinction or remove the friction from going from one platform to the other. And that's where we then started kind of building out the feature store with like a caching layer where you can write the features into, as well as kind of a more central way where during the development process, the data scientists would write their functions, register them with the feature store, where they get executed to do the offline transformation. But then they were also already ready, and we knew it was exactly the same function that was executed, could now be executed in real time too, write their response into the cache, and then make it available to the models that we're running. And so by implementing this, we were effectively cutting down the time to deploy a model from 2-3 months to less than a day, or effectively like under an hour.
Wow. So this was something, the feature store as you're describing it is something that your team built from scratch, or did you use some off the shelf as well?
I mean, we used off the shelf, open source, or kind of cloud provider components, and then glued them together to give us the functionality of the feature store. So
got it. And then was it your AI/ML team that was responsible for doing most of the heavy lifting here?
Yeah, so we, even before, we had an engineering team, and so we basically, I took a number of people and said, let's kind of, given the experience, it makes sense for us to build kind of machine learning framework components to make the training, and in this case, especially the serving, easier to use, more performant, and also to kind of consolidate the effort around optimizing serving, right? There, given like the number of customers we have in the millions, if you can make even serving more efficient, you save the business a lot of money, right? Even in addition to the quality of the models. And so since we don't want every team to repeat the effort of optimizing your serving infrastructure, consolidating into one seemed like a good idea. And so we carved out the team and that said, okay, this is our biggest pain point right now. How can we reduce time to delivery? And then they came up with, at the time, people didn't really talk about feature stores, but then it's pretty much what you now consider the feature store concept.
That's great. I mean, this sounds, definitely like a huge win for your team. And I think, most DSLs out there should be, it sounds like, considering going down that path. I mean, the last question here is, for those out there who are considering going down the path of building out a feature store, is there any sort of lessons learned, anything that, like, you would recommend?
I mean, in general, I believe that anything worthwhile, you probably have to build twice. Kind of once to figure out if it's the right thing, and then the second time to build it right, to build the thing right. And so, like, given that there are now solutions out there, if you're interested in kind of getting something quickly, I probably would evaluate kind of like some of the vendor solutions. Just see if they serve your purpose. If they do, great. It's probably not worth developing it yourself. If you have kind of unique needs, either based on the data the data types that you're dealing with, the speed, the scale, latency, etc., then you can kind of maybe start with one of the solutions and evolve from it. And like a lot what we are actually doing now with our frameworks is not building things from scratch. There's so many good tools out there. Like, we kind of more use it as like build like a slight abstraction on top of the process, so that you use the API and then we can swap in and out different tools as needed or expand, but still make the whole kind of pipeline work well together, no matter what tool you use for the different components.
That sounds like great advice. Well, Jan, this has been an absolute pleasure. Today we talked a bit about, managing a very large team. I mean, having a 250 to 300 person team We learned a little bit about some of the approaches that you have. I mean, obviously put great leaders in place, and how to sort of manage that, and then just how to stay active. We heard everything from a few podcasts, different podcasts that you like to listen to, and even when you listen to your podcasts. But also, I think it's just a reminder to all of us that staying current, not just about the innovation that's going on from a data science perspective, but also if you're a DSL, hearing a little bit about the practice of managing people, managing your customer, how to be a great leader. All of these are absolutely appropriate as a DSL as well. And then last but not least, we segued into talking about the feature store, and how that can sort of really decrease time to value from the going from training to actually the serving aspect. And it sounds, if you're cutting things down by 2 months, that's a phenomenal savings, and I'm sure your customers are absolutely loving the improved time to value. If folks want to get in touch with you, Jan, can they link up with you on LinkedIn, or do you have a presence on social media?
Yeah, it's just my first name, last name on LinkedIn. So there you find me, Jan Neumann.
Great. Well, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you very much for joining the DSL podcast, Jan.
The pleasure was all mine. Thanks so much for having me, Dave.
You bet.